Hi, class. It's Dr. Lindner. We are on organic compounds. In a previous video, we introduced organic compounds and some of the properties, and we also got into some of the functional groups, so you should review those. Now let's get into carbohydrates. Carbohydrates. So sugars and starches, those are going to make up about half of the US diet, sugar and starches. And that makes up what we call a SAD diet, which is the standard American diet. That's not sarcasm, it's actually referred to as the SAD diet, standard American diet. And it's because of this, we have so much metabolic syndrome, we have type 2 diabetes, and even type 3 diabetes, which is Alzheimer's disease, and mostly induced by lifestyle and diet and can be corrected the same way. Type 1 is different, right? Type 1 diabetes is an autoimmune condition against the beta cells of the islets of Langerhans. It's the beta cells of the pancreas that produce insulin. Okay. So carbohydrates are important for energy source, and they're catabolized rather than stored. And there are three different size carbohydrate molecules. You may have heard of these: monosaccharides, disaccharides, and polysaccharides. We'll talk about the different classifications under each. So carbohydrates are a diverse group of substances formed by carbons, hydrogens, and oxygens. And it's the ratio of one carbon atom. You have one carbon atom for each water molecule. So carbohydrates literally breaks down to watered carbons. So when we look at that, we have 6 carbons, 12 hydrogens, and 6 oxygens. This is glucose. And when we look at glucose, it's typically drawn like this, where it's this, as we can see, a 6 carbon sugar. That's glucose. Anything that ends in ose is always a sugar. Remember, when something ends in an ace, it's an enzyme. And when something ends in ogen, it means it's inactive or in the storage form. So in order to use glucose for energy, the body has to break it down. So we break it down right through the center, and then that becomes these 2 3-carbon sugars, right? All we did is break this bond here and here, right? We broke this bond and this bond, and we've gone from glucose to pyruvic acid. And now this pyruvic acid, and by the way, this process here is called glycolysis. And if this is a cell, there's the nucleus, and let's say here's a mitochondria, and everything around here is the cytosol, the cytoplasm with the organelles. This step of glycolysis takes place here in the cytoplasm or the cytosol. But once we have pyruvic acid in the presence of oxygen, the pyruvic acid can enter the mitochondria. So we've gone from glucose to pyruvic acid, right? 2 3-carbon sugars, and that in the presence of oxygen can enter the mitochondria for the 2 other main steps of ATP production. The first one is called the Krebs cycle, named after Hans Krebs, also known as the citric acid cycle. And then the second phase is called the electron transport chain, the ETC. And the Krebs cycle produces coenzymes, And the coenzymes are needed by the electron transport chain to produce the majority of the ATP. And then the byproduct of this is going to be heat. Your body gives off heat. It's going to give off ATP, and it's going to give off carbon dioxide, which is what we exhale. Sometimes we call this cellular respiration as well. Okay, so that's kind of like the big picture. Carbohydrates are the main function or the main functional route or the source of energy so that we can produce ATP, adenosine triphosphate. The body doesn't like to store glucose because glucose in high concentrations is pretty toxic. It's toxic to our neurons. It's toxic to our blood vessels. It damages the endothelial lining of our blood vessels and the heart and our neurons and our brain. So the body says, all right, we got too much of this. Let's put it in storage. And the body typically stores it in the liver and in muscle. And the storage form of that is glycogen, right? Anything that ends in ogen is the storage form. We store glucose as glycogen in the liver and in the muscle. And if you're in a fasting state, our body can break that down and convert it back into glucose. Okay. So the two critical hormones that are involved, insulin and glucagon. So insulin, when your blood sugar is high, the beta cells of the pancreas recognize that it's high, and it tries to lower the amount of glucose in your blood by driving it into the cell. Okay. When your blood sugar is too low, the alpha cells of the pancreas can release glucagon. Glucagon goes to the liver and says, glucose, be gone. So it actually takes the stored glucose as glycogen, breaks it down, and converts it to glucose. And that's what the body does. So these two are both produced by the pancreas, insulin by the beta cells, glucagon by the alpha cells, and they work in harmony. One's designed to raise blood sugar, the other is designed to lower blood sugar. Sugar is also the building block of DNA and RNA, because if we look at the term deoxyribose nucleic acid or ribose nucleic acid. So we do need carbohydrates for that. Now, when we look at the types of carbohydrates, we have monosaccharides, disaccharides, and we have polysaccharides. So the monosaccharides are simple sugars, and they contain somewhere between 3 to 7 carbon atoms. The disaccharides, these two are simple sugars, and they're formed from combining of 2 monosaccharides. So now when you're going from something smaller into something bigger, that requires dehydration synthesis, right? That's when it's going to pull together a hydroxyl group and hydrogen from the other. It's going to combine them. And when we combine them, we get H2O, so dehydration synthesis. The monosaccharides, these are the main ones, glucose, fructose, and galactose. Glucose is the main blood sugar. Fructose is found in fruits, and galactose is the sugar that's found in milk. Then we have deoxyribose, which is DNA, and ribose for RNA. Now, when we combine these, when we bring 2 monosaccharides together, we get disaccharides. So if we take a glucose and a fructose, right, if we take these two, we take these 2 monosaccharides and bring it together, that's going to give you table sugar, sucrose. If we take glucose and galactose, we take those two, we get lactose. So glucose and galactose gives us lactose, milk sugar. Now, if we take 2 glucoses and combine them, you get maltose, like a malted beer. Glucose and glucose, that's maltose. When we go from something larger and we want to break it down into this is what requires hydrolysis, which is now taking the H2O, breaking it down, and putting back the hydroxide and the hydrogen, and you get monosaccharides again, right? So you got dehydration synthesis when you're going from monosaccharides to disaccharides, or if we're going from disaccharides, something larger into something smaller, that's hydrolysis. This is anabolism going this way, catabolism going this way. Now, polysaccharides, when we think of polysaccharides, we think of starch, we think of glycogen, and we think of cellulose. So glucose turns to glycogen in animals, right? Because remember, glucose is highly toxic in high concentrations. But in plants, it turns to starch. The glucose can also damage the plant, so it stores it as starch. So the storage form of sugar in us is glycogen. The storage form of glucose in a plant is called starch. Cellulose is part of the cell wall in plants that can't be digested by humans, but it aids movement of food through the intestines. So it's fibrous. Okay. Think of corn, right? You could tell how quickly your digestive tract moves because when you have a bowel movement, you'll see the corn in there, won't you? So these are the monosaccharides, glucose, fructose, and galactose. You don't have to memorize these structural formulations. You certainly don't have to be able to draw them out. But I just want you to see, here's your deoxyribose and ribose. The structures are a little bit different, right? Look at glucose. It's a hexose sugar. Fructose is a pentose sugar. They're slightly different. They're arranged in a little bit of a different order. So the disaccharide, this is just a great visual showing us when we go from monosaccharide into a disaccharide, we need dehydration synthesis in order to do that. So in this example, we have glucose at this end and fructose. When we combine them, here's the OH, there's your hydroxyl. Here's a hydrogen. When you combine them, you have two hydrogens and an oxygen. Well, that's what H2O is, two hydrogens and an oxygen. And now we can form a bond here. So fructose and glucose come together with dehydration synthesis and create sucrose. When you go from table sugar or sucrose and we want to break it down, it takes water, hydrolysis, but we're going to break it down going this way. See the arrow going this way, putting the hydrogen and hydroxide back. So this is a great picture showing dehydration synthesis going from smaller to larger, or going from something larger to smaller using hydrolysis. All carbs except monosaccharides need to be broken down by hydrolysis before they can be used for energy. Sugars are typically stored as fat for energy. This is what triglycerides are. When you check someone's cholesterol and they have their HDLs and LDLs and triglycerides, if you have high triglycerides, that's sugar in a fat cell. Fat cells can be small, fat cells can be large. They hypertrophy and atrophy. Fat cells can store sugar, and they also store toxins, both. The way that you can lower triglycerides, well, if it's sugar that's ready to be used for energy, it's exercise, movement. Anytime you're exercising and moving, you're going to be burning sugar and carbohydrates first for fuel. Keep in mind, there are artificial sweeteners that the body just can't recognize. The body can only break down and recognize things that are carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. You have a lot of artificial sweeteners that aren't sucrose, that have these other names, like they make it sound like sucrose, but it's sucralose, right? These things are like 8,000 to 10,000 times sweeter than sugar, but they don't create an insulin spike. Okay, but they've done enough studies to show the artificial sweeteners in Diet Coke, Diet Pepsi, Diet Sprite, all these diet sodas, people don't tend to lose any weight by any means with them. In fact, the opposite thing happens because it ignites the taste buds for sweetness without spiking an insulin response. So it usually results in the sweet tooth winning out. But these artificial sweeteners can't be broken down properly by the liver. So in the liver, where we have phase 1 and phase 2 liver detoxification, there's lots of reactive oxygen species that are produced that could be quite damaging to the cell membrane, and even the mitochondria. And that's why we need antioxidants to combat the oxidants, the reactive oxygen species. These are like the bullets. And remember, our bodies, our cells itself within the cytoplasm, we have copper zinc superoxide dismutase, right? Copper zinc superoxide dismutase. And in the mitochondria, we have manganese superoxide dismutase to try and handle some of the reactive oxygen species that are trying to damage it. And our bodies also use glutathione, a very powerful antioxidant, to combat that. And remember, glutathione is made up of 3 amino acids: cysteine, glycine, and glutamine. Those 3 amino acids make it. Vitamin C is important because it recycles it. It recycles glutathione. Okay, so the polysaccharides, these contain 10 or hundreds of monosaccharides joined together. Remember, starch, glycogen, and cellulose. The storage form of glucose in plants is starch. High concentrations of glucose in the plant or animal we know is toxic. So we store the glucose as glycogen. The plant stores it as starch for safety. So eating starches is probably not the best thing for us to be doing in high concentrations. Glycogen is the storage form of glucose in humans. We store it in the liver, in the liver cells, the hepatocytes, and we store it in muscle. If the serum glucose levels fall, right, if your blood glucose levels fall, then the liver can take the glycogen and convert it into glucose, and it uses glucagon for that. Cellulose can only be digested in small amounts and typically by bacterial action of bacteria that's in our colon. Cellulose, we call that dietary fiber. Water soluble is found in fruits and veggies, and these are all involved in lowering cholesterol. We know that fiber helps to lower cholesterol purely by allowing bowel movements to happen. You can reduce cholesterol by moving your bowels and having fiber. Fiber helps remove the cholesterol and toxins. Insoluble fiber is found in nuts and grains. Okay. So to summarize, when you look at the carbohydrates in the body, we have the monosaccharides, disaccharides, and polysaccharides. Glucose and fructose are just 2 examples of monosaccharides. Disaccharides, you got sucrose, lactose, and maltose. An example of polysaccharides are glycogen. We know glycogen is the storage form of glucose. All of these are an energy source, and all of these are an energy source. The glucose is manufactured in the body, and it's also obtained from food, and then we distribute it throughout the body, distributed in body fluids. Sucrose is table sugar, lactose is in milk, and maltose is malt sugar that's found through the germination process of grains, like malted beer. All of those must be broken down into monosaccharides for absorption. Okay. When we come back, we will get into lipids and fats.